far in this series, we got an introduction to apologetics, looked at a couple of arguments for God's existence, talked about the reliability of the Bible, and now, in today's session, we're going to be answering the question, is the resurrection of Jesus true? And as we get started, consider this quote from the late Tim Keller in his book, The Reason for God, Belief in an Age of Skepticism. He says, if Jesus rose from the dead, then you have to accept all that he said. If he didn't rise from the dead, then why worry about any of what he said? The issue on which everything hangs is not whether or not you like his teaching, but whether or not he rose from the dead. You see, the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the single most important event in the history of the universe. There is nothing close. So let's talk about some of the evidence. There's a tremendous amount of content we can discuss, but for our time together, I just want to give you 4 brief arguments for the resurrection. Number 1, the martyrdom argument. Number 2, the eyewitness argument. Number 3, the early creedal argument. And number 4, we're going to look at some proposed skeptical arguments, and we're going to see that the best skeptical theories against the resurrection that have been produced in the past 2,000 years, and how upon examination of them, they actually really give more proof that Jesus, in fact, just rose from the grave as the Bible and history proclaim. With that said, let's briefly talk about the martyrdom argument. You see, according to the Gospels, when Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his crucifixion, all of the disciples scattered in fear. Matthew 26:56 says, then all the disciples left him, being Jesus, and fled. Of these disciples, the only one present at the crucifixion was John. And after Jesus' death, John 20 verse 19 says that the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews. Essentially, the disciples thought they got Jesus, now they're coming for us. So here's the big question. How do you go from cowardice disciples at the end of the Gospels to courageous disciples as seen in the book of Acts? Were it not for this pivotal moment of the literal resurrected Jesus that transformed their lives, consider this. All of the disciples were tortured, imprisoned, exiled, and or murdered for simply being Christians preaching the resurrection. And no one willingly dies for a lie. Also, if one of them knew that Jesus truly hadn't resurrected, then one of the disciples would have confessed that. Let's now move on to the eyewitness argument. There's a lot of eyewitness accounts within the New Testament and even many historians outside of the Bible, but I want to draw your attention to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, known as the resurrection chapter, and particularly verse 6, where Paul states, quote, then he, being Jesus, appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, end quote. You know what that means? Paul was saying at about 55 AD when he wrote to the Corinthians, he was saying that over 500 saw the risen Jesus at one time, and then he says most of them are still alive, meaning over 250 of them, he's telling the Corinthians and others, you can go interview over 250 people right now who saw the risen Jesus. Now, Paul could not make such a bold claim were it not for the fact that this was historically true. And in any court case, eyewitness testimony is a major factor. The New Testament and many sources outside of the New Testament claim that many were eyewitnesses to the physical resurrection of Jesus. Thirdly, let's now move on to the early creedal argument. Now, I need you to track with me because the chronology of these events is very important. Jesus was crucified in 33 AD. Paul, who was a hardened skeptic known as Saul of Tarsus attacking the church, he got saved in 34 AD because of a personal encounter with the risen Jesus, according to Acts chapter 9. Paul then visits Jerusalem in 36 AD, according to Galatians chapter 1, verse 18, where he gets personally discipled by Peter and the other apostles, undoubtedly learning more about the resurrection. And then Paul writes in 1 Corinthians in 55 AD. Therefore, the creed that he writes, which a creed was an early agreed upon statement, doctrinal statement. Therefore, the creed that Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 through 5, is something the whole church knew to be true from the very first days of the death and resurrection of Christ. And he says this, so important, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 3 through 5, this is the early creed of the church. Paul writes this, quote, "For I delivered to you," speaking to the Corinthians, "as of first importance, what I also received." So Paul received this. He didn't make it up. He received it. Here it is. Here's the creed. That Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures. Verse 4, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. And that he appeared to Cephas, being Peter, and then to the 12. End quote. So here's why this is so important. Because Paul received this creed from the disciple Ananias, likely in 34 AD when Paul got saved. But he definitely received this creed in 36 AD when he was personally discipled in Jerusalem by Peter and the other apostles, proving this, that the reality of the resurrection was widely agreed upon right after Jesus's resurrection historically, 3 days after his death. And here's the point. Paul nor others made up the resurrection narrative years later. This is an objection that some skeptics give. Oh, Christians made up the resurrection years later. Whereas no, from the very earliest days, the early church agreed Jesus physically rose from the dead. Finally, let's look at the best proposed skeptical theories to show that the past 2,000 years of skepticism has not really provided a whole lot of good evidence against the resurrection. And so here's the 5 proposed skeptical theories. Number 1 is the swoon theory. Here's what it states, that Jesus really didn't die, that he was beaten to the point where he could not even be recognized as a human being anymore, according to the prophet Isaiah, that his back was made like hamburger meat, he was crucified, he was stabbed in his side, blood and water came out, taken down from the cross, he was wrapped in burial cloths and the spices, put into the tomb, and here's the swoon theory. That Jesus didn't really die. He was laid upon the cold slab of the tomb, and it kind of swooned and woke him up. And then Jesus, on the verge of physical death, if he had not already died at this point, then on his nail-scarred hands and feet, he went over to the outer rock closing the tomb. Again, it was sealed by Roman guards. He moved this massive stone out of the divot in the ground, which the rock would have fallen into, moved it on his own, and somehow snuck past the Roman guards, which would not have ever happened historically, and then physically appeared to his disciples saying, "Here I am, I'm the risen Jesus," which doesn't make sense. He could not have survived. The Romans were great at killing people. He could not have moved the stone on his own. He could not have escaped the Roman guards. They were great at their jobs. And even if he appeared to the disciples, he looked horrible. He would have been on the verge of death. Even skeptics would agree Jesus died. So the swoon theory doesn't hold a lot of water. Secondly is the theft theory. In fact, when the Roman guards were left with this empty tomb, they ran not to their supervisors, they ran to the Jewish leaders and said, "The tomb is empty, he is gone." And notice what the Jewish leaders said, and they bribed them, saying, "Just say somebody stole the body." Now, if somebody truly stole the body, again, that doesn't explain how you go from cowardice disciples to courageous disciples, knowing that Jesus had not truly risen from the dead. And if somebody truly stole the body, then when these Christians go around preaching the resurrection, all somebody had to do was bring out the body of the dead Jesus, and that would have killed Christianity in its cradle. And some people would say the disciples stole the body. Remember, you have highly trained Roman guards sealing the tomb. The disciples were mostly fishermen, not trained warriors. And what did they all do upon Jesus' arrest? They fled. Again, they were cowards. They would not have gone to the tomb and attacked the Roman guards and stolen the body. And if the disciples stole the body, nobody willingly dies for a lie. You would not see what we see in the book of Acts and in early history that records things that happened in the first 30 years of the early church. It would not have taken place. Thirdly, you have the hallucination theory. This one is hilarious. Everybody hallucinated the risen Jesus. Now, I'm going to give you a funny example. If 500 people all took a hallucinogen drug, let's say 500 people took LSD, and they're all hallucinating, they are not all hallucinating the same thing. They're all hallucinating very different things. You cannot say that several hundred people who saw the risen Jesus in those 40 days that he was alive, post-resurrection, before his ascension, you cannot say they were all just hallucinating the same thing. But let's just say that they were all hallucinating the same thing. Let's go with that theory. Number one, all the religious leaders had to do was say, you guys are crazy. They would have pulled out the body of the dead Jesus, would have killed Christianity in its beginning. Number two, still doesn't account how you go from cowardice disciples to courageous disciples if all these people were truly hallucinating. So hallucination theory doesn't hold a lot of water. Number four is the twin theory. This one, again, is hilarious. That nobody knew that Jesus had a twin. That Jesus' family, everybody knew his family, especially by the time of his crucifixion, because Jesus was basically a rock star by the time he was crucified. He had performed all these miracles. Everybody knew who he was. But nobody knew that he had a twin. Let's just say he did have a twin, that upon Jesus' death and his burial, that his twin comes out and tells the disciples and everybody else, I'm the risen Jesus. Again, if there was a body to produce, they could have taken out the body, said, that's his twin, that's not the risen Jesus, and would have killed Christianity. And again, the disciples doesn't explain cowardice to courageous. And he did not have a twin. It's not that nobody knew about this twin, he didn't exist. Twin theory doesn't work. Fifth and final one, again, this is the best skeptics have provided in over 2,000 years. The fifth and final theory is the wrong tomb theory. The wrong tomb theory says everybody got the wrong tomb. The guards guarded the wrong tomb. It was Pontius Pilate who sent the guards to the wrong tomb. The Jewish leaders got the wrong tomb. The disciples ran to the wrong tomb. The women went to the wrong tomb. The guards were guarding the wrong tomb. And Joseph of Arimathea, whose tomb it was, he must have gotten the wrong tomb as well, which, by the way, losing a tomb was like losing a small house in those days. In fact, the Bible says that nobody had even laid in this tomb. It's almost as if, again, fulfilled prophecy, that Joseph of Arimathea purchased and cut out this tomb just for Jesus. Again, let's just say everybody got the wrong tomb. At some point, Jesus, who was very popular by this point, somebody would have found the body of Jesus. Again, very popular, highly unlikely that everybody got the wrong tomb. Secondly, again, does not account for cowardice to courageous disciples. Now, again, there's lots of content we could cover. For more evidence on the resurrection of Jesus, I highly recommend you look into the resources by Dr. Sean McDowell and Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Gary Habermas is perhaps the first and foremost scholar on the resurrection. With all that said, in our next session, our final session in this Apologetics series together, we'll be answering the question, if God is all good and all powerful, then why does he allow evil and suffering in the world? Until then, God bless you. I'm praying for you and I'm cheering you on as we follow Jesus together.